my dad opened a shop in 1960 when he was 28 years old. He had been in the military, and then he had worked in the oil field some after he married my mom and all that. And I was born in '57 here, and that was his shop in the '70s. And he owned. I mean, I remember counting up one time before I was 18 years old. I probably owned 18 different Volkswagen Bugs, you know, because he would get those things coming in there, and he would work on them. The old Renaults, like the one that you saw in the previous picture, he said that when he was working on in his first shop, those would come in knocking and smoking, and you could buy it for $100, and in less than a day you could throw a set of rings in there, and he said to build it up and drive it around, and then you'd sell it for $500-600, because he said whenever those things were new, you'd be driving one thing, it's just what I need, and then they would fall apart before they had before a couple of years went by. But anyway, this Volkswagen here is going to be the focus of what I'm talking about. '66 model Bug that he built from the ground up. He basically put all kinds of stuff together and just built him a car like he wanted from various different parts and all that. And it turned out to be a very dependable car. And so now the one that you're seeing that picture right there is a '58 model Volkswagen Bug that I drove when I was right out of high school. And he had shaved 125 thousandths off the cylinder heads with a cylinder head resurfacing thing. It was a hand-operated thing he had, and he raised the compression really, really high on that thing. And boy, would it ever scream! It was stronger than any Bug I had ever driven. And this was the Bug that whenever I first got it, we stuffed an engine in it, and I drove it down a dirt road, and I noticed that it didn't handle worth a flip. And I came back, I said, when I turned the wheel one way, it looked like trying to roll the other way. And what my dad said, he said, well, it doesn't have a sway bar on it. And so if you'll turn that 64, or take that 64 model, the front axle off of it, which has a sway bar on it, put it on here, it'll drive a lot different. Boy, after I did that, it drove like a Porsche. And I drove that car to Texas down there a couple of times. Whenever I was driving along on the interstate, I'd surprise some of the higher powered cars. It was a sleeper. I mean, you could just get out on that thing and it would run off and leave about, anything except a super duper hot rod or whatever. But for a little 58 Volkswagen Bug, it was super strong. I had an oil pressure gauge on the dash though, when I was going pretty fast on the interstate. In the summertime, if the oil pressure started to drop a little bit, I'd slow down and let it come back up, because they're air cooled, but the oil is the large part of the cooling that takes place there. Well, I was working not long out of high school after wheat harvest and all. I worked at a Gulf station in a little town where I grew up. My dad still had his shop down there. It's kind of funny. This guy that was running this Gulf station was a guy named Ed. He was a really, really good mechanic. But one day I learned something. We had pulled the transmission out of one of those old Mercury Capris, those old early '70s funny looking Mercury Capris, and it had a sort of, some of that car had German roots or whatever, but it had a little V6 engine, and it was largely a Ford, but parts of it were German. And Ed said, we lost one of the bell housing bolts, and Ed said, I don't have any metric bolts. And so he took it down to my dad's shop, and I was with him, and he walked in there and says, you have a metric bolt like this? And my dad looked at it and said, that's not metric, that's 3HUS standard. And I was thinking, as good of a mechanic as Ed is, he could not look at a bolt and tell it was standard or metric. And so I worked on teaching my students to do that for a long time. My dad also taught me how to sharpen drill bits just on the grinder, and I didn't see a lot of mechanics that would even try that, although there are some of you guys that probably do. But I moved to Port Arthur, Texas, because Ed went down there. He was a helicopter mechanic, and he had a good helicopter mechanic job down there in the late '70s. And so I went down there in 1977, moved into this rooming house you see behind me there. There's 52 rooms and 2 bathrooms in that rooming house. I had a little room that was about 10 by 12, had a bed and a table and that kind of thing in there. $25 a week is what I paid to live there and all that. But that place was called the Moore House. It's not there anymore. I think years later I heard that it burned down, a long time after I moved out of there. But I was working down there for about 5 years, and so anyway, I came back with a wife and some kids, and but while I was down there, I actually swapped him out of the '66 Volkswagen Bug that he had had for a long time, And I drove that thing. It was a really good car. I drove it all over the place. I mean, never had a bit of problem with it. It was just a solid car. Every now and then, everything just comes together, and you have a really good car, you know. And this was a mighty fine automobile. It was an older one, but Eminent Domain claimed my dad's shop. That's my Uncle Earl standing there drinking coffee in my dad's shop out there on the highway. And he had a good location, but Eminent Domain claimed his land because they were going to run another lane through there. During the Carter presidency, he was buying up all that land. He was going to, you know, four-lane a bunch of highways and all that. And, you know, Carter was replaced in office by Reagan. I voted for Reagan. And we got him, he was in there, and Reagan was trying to balance the budget, so he didn't do a lot of this highway construction that Carter was going to do. Clinton got back in there. He did the highway construction, and all that road was built. But Dad had to move his, he didn't want to take the little bit of money they paid him for his house, for his land and his shop, and go into debt and try to build a, you know, bigger shop in town and all that kind of stuff. So he just did what he had to do, and he built a shop out there at the house. And it was a small building. It wasn't all that big, but it was big enough for him. See, when he left the foreign car garage shop out there, he decided the least amount of overhead and the least amount of help and the most amount of money I can make, I can just hone my work down to working on Volkswagen Bug. Now later on in the early 80s, he worked on some Rabbits and stuff, you know, because I had gone to work at the dealership for a little while. And, you know, I gave him the heads up on, you know, fixing Rabbits and stuff. And he made a pretty good bit of money working on those too, because they weren't really that hard to work on, not even the diesels, you know. But one way or another, his notion was, since he had so many regular customers, he didn't even put up a sign. They'd find him if they wanted him. And they did. They went and found out where he was, and there he is standing in front of his shop out there. You know, that was in the 70s when he built that place. This is where I was living in Port Arthur on Lakeshore Drive, 3924 Lakeshore Drive, Port Arthur, Texas. I bought that house in 1980 for $16,000, and the house is still there. Doesn't look exactly like that, but it's still there if you want to look it up on Google Earth. They've actually closed in the carport and made a garage out of it. But you see that blue truck sitting there. That was just one of the vehicles that I had. You know, the other was a Volkswagen Bug. While I was living down there, it's kind of funny. Those little older Volkswagen Bugs, if you're familiar with them, they've got a little, behind the spare tire in the front up there, they've got a little brake fluid reservoir. And that brake fluid reservoir's got a little pipe going down through a little rubber grommet into the master cylinder, which is right, you know, behind where the pedals are down there. And that little, the weakness that those old cars had was that little grommet would start to leak, and the next thing you know, without warning, you got no brakes. That was the same thing that happened on another Volkswagen I had. It was similar to that. But anyway, the only problem I ever really had with that little 66 Bug, I pulled into a convenience store down there, zoomed into the parking lot like I ordinarily would. I wasn't going all that fast, but when I hit the brake, there was no brake, and I jerked up on the park brake, and the cable broke, and I jumped up over the little walkway there and ran into a newspaper machine, just smashed that thing up against the wall really good. Well, I took that 66 Bug back home, and what I'd seen my dad do when he was doing body work, I would take this, both sides of this bumper, because it had pushed the front of the Bug in, it makes the lights point toward the ground. I hooked it to the trailer ball on my pickup truck and backed up and went bam, and I snatched it back out. So it was like it never even happened, and that thing never leaked brake fluid again, even though that's all I did, you know. But one way or another, that little 66 Volkswagen, except for that, was an excellent car. All right, so Dad had gone to Tennessee. By the time I was moving back in 1983 to Alabama, he decided to go to Tennessee and learn how to do sawmill stuff, because he was going to put him in a sawmill down there behind the shop, so he could actually make a little extra money doing that. I don't know what put that thought in his head, but anyway, he decided he was going to do that. And so he was up there, and while he was up there, I was running his shop, because I had come back and I was, you know, needed some income, so I got out and opened his shop and just started doing the same kind of work he did, you know, which I knew how to do. And I'm going to tell you about a vehicle that I fixed right there. Patty was a girl she was a customer that came, and she had this 70 model Volkswagen Bug she had bought from this little guy in this little town over close to here where there used to be speed traps, and you know, it had some used car lots over there that were kind of shysterish and all that. But anyway, she had bought this 70 model Bug from this guy, and she was driving it around, and the first time I worked on it, you know, I did some little stuff that she was complaining about that was broke down on it. And it looked good on the inside out. It would have had all kinds of problems. It kept having one problem after another, and it seemed like it was like whack-a-mole. When I'd fix this problem, another problem somewhere would pop up. And you know, those Volkswagen Bugs, if you're not familiar with them, the old air-cooled ones, had to have the oil changed every 1,500 miles. and you had to adjust the valves regularly, and the brakes had to be adjusted. There wasn't hardly anything that you didn't need to fool with on those things all the time. And they didn't have an oil filter on them per se, but they did have a little screen you could take out and clean when you pull this round plate off right here. And all the later models had a drain plug. But the earlier models, a lot of them didn't. One way or another, I worked on it, but I went over there, when the first day she brought it for me to work on it, I was doing the tune-up and the work she wanted done, and she disappeared. Couldn't figure out where she went, because the shop was kind of out in the country, and I looked around, didn't know where she was and all that stuff, and she came walking back in, and I said, "Where'd you go?" And she was soaking wet because it was raining out there, and she said, "I just went for a walk." And she was a sort of a little, the hippies from the late 60s, early 70s. She reminded me of one of them. She had, I never really saw any of her kids, but she had 3 kids, and she had been dumped by her husband and all, and she was trying to get by on her own. But anyway, I went out there to the bus station. She called me one day, and the left front wheel was wobbling around like a cartoon car, and that little pinch bolt hadn't been tightened by whoever put it back together, and it was wobbling around all over the place. So I had to take some parts out there and fix that at the bus station and all that. There was another time the spring on the points broke, and it put her down beside the road. And then the fan belt broke. I don't know why it broke. It looked like it looked okay. And so whenever, she was really kind of at the end of her rope, didn't have a lot of money and all that kind of stuff. And I had plenty of other work in there. So I was able to take a little time that after the fan belt broke, overheated it, took the temper out of the rings. I jerked the motor out, pulled it down, threw a set of rings in it, put it all back together. It ran just fine. I think I charged her $45 to do that, just for the parts and a little bit of labor. But if you've done any work on a Volkswagen Bug, you know that you can have the motor out in about 20 minutes if you know how to do it right, and if you've done it a lot. And you can tear the motor down and repair it in like 2 or 3 hours. You can have the thing put back together, a new set of rings in it, if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you'll think it's the weirdest thing you ever worked on, especially if all you ever worked on is non-air-cooled American cars, and people would be confused by those that I got worked on a lot. But she had that 70 model. This looks almost exactly like it. I found this picture online, but that's what it looked like. It was that color. It was that year model, 70 model. You can tell it was a 70 model. The 70 and 71 models had that, and the 72s had that little reflector on the side of that, and these bigger turn signal things on the front. But I had about all the kinks worked out of it, but it had put her down so many times. She was just sick of that car, and she didn't trust it. She couldn't really afford to buy another one. And I told her, I said, this 66 model I've got runs just fine, and I have never had a problem with it. I drove to Texas back. She said, well, make it to the beach. And I said, yeah. And now in Alabama, before 1975, you didn't have to have a title. All you had to have a little bill of sale, a tag receipt and all that. So we swapped bills of sale at vehicles, and she drove away on that 66 Bug, happy as she could be. And she drove it around all over the place. And every now and then she'd bring it in to have the oil change and valve adjustment and whatnot done on it. And she was just tickled pink, never had a problem. And of course, by that time, her 70 model Bug, if she'd just kept driving it, it would have been okay. But she didn't want it anymore. That was her whole deal. So she brought the thing, so anyway, so let me get on with my story here. Decent looking paint job. That's another shot of kind of what it looked like. It's a pretty car, nicer car than the other one I had. But a year later, I sold the 70 model Bug for $1,000. That was kind of funny because that guy that I sold it to called me up. He goes, I took this thing to the car wash, and the first time I washed it with a high pressure car wash, it washed the paint off of it. Well, that's the kind of stuff that guy that sold her the car, he would just wash a car and have somebody put a good, nice slick looking paint job on it with a minimal amount of work, and the paint job looked good, but the paint just barely was on there. Now I just washed it with a bucket and a rag. Of course, the guy didn't get mad about it because he said I was just going to repaint the car anyway. That's when the paint washed off first time I washed it. I thought that was kind of funny. But she still bought that 5066 back to me for service whenever it was needed. Well, right before Dad came back from Tennessee, the guy I had worked for at the gas station said, I've got a shop up here, because I was kind of in a holding pattern, just waiting, for something to come along that I felt like I could do a little better than, running Dad's little shop. And he says, you want to come up here and work for me? And I said, sure, I'll go work for you up there. And so I went to work for him at this little station, this little shop he had built behind the gas station that he used to have. And it was really pretty good work. Well, Daddy came back and reopened his shop again. He came back from Tennessee. He was going to take his time getting the sawmill put in. Meantime, he needed the income, so he reopened his shop. And he says, you traded my good 66 model bug. He had sold me for a piece of junk. Of course, the car that I was driving, I didn't think it was a piece of junk. I mean, the one that I had sold, I was still driving it at that time. Anyway, the deal was, he got his sawmill set up and running, and I built a 4-bedroom house with oak lumber we sawed out. There he was, running the sawmill, and this here was stacking lumber on his lumber rack out there. And he did a lot of hard work on that. I'm telling you, that will, if you, a one-man sawmill is nothing to sneeze at. That is hard work. He worked 10, 12 hours a day. He was in his 50s then. He's 88 years old now. That's the house that I built. 40,000 board feet of oak lumber, 10,000 pounds of shingles, 2,000 square feet of heated living area, 800 square feet of shady porches, front and back, and an 800 square foot basement work area. That says work R, but I meant it right, work area. And so that was the deal, that little sideline there. Well, what was funny was one time Patty came back and she said, where's Richard? And he says, well, this is my shop. He was just running it while I was gone. And she said, well, I'm not letting you work on this car. Nobody but him is going to work on this car. He was a little bit insulted, but he was proud of me at the same time, because he built the car from the ground up and she wouldn't even let him touch it. All right, so anyway, now on this Mazda 6, and I'm going to show you a picture of the guy working on it in a minute. This guy ran into his wife ran into a concrete post, and she managed to bust the plastic housing at the radiator and all. And she bent the condenser, and I had a picture of that somewhere that I took from the side, and I couldn't find it anywhere. You got all the pictures on your computer, and you look and look and look and look and look. I remember seeing it a few days ago, but I didn't, couldn't find it today. I was going to put a picture of it on here. But anyway, it just messed it all up. So he had to put all that back together, and that's Bobby putting that stuff on there. He had to pull the whole front, the bumper, and everything off the car. The bumper wasn't really hurt all that bad because it was plastic, but that radiator and that, it wasn't leaking or anything, but boy, it bent that stuff so bad and busted the plastic housing it was in. And so that was just a little sideline there. All right, and so we tackled a P047A EGR sensor 2 code on a 2009 TDI Jetta. And this guy eventually, when Volkswagen had that problem with their, programming the vehicles to beat the emission test, he got his money back. He got like $9,000 for this and bought a different kind of car. But that little EGR sensor there's 2 of those on that car. And it's a remote relative of the DPFE sensor, but the funky oil route right behind the oil filler cap hides the sensor we replaced. It was down here. There was another one here. The one we had to replace was back there. You're not real careful, you replace the wrong one on one of those little suckers. Now this is more recent. My dad had this 96 Chevy pickup that he bought for $800. And he had a couple other vehicles too. I will tell you another couple of stories. We replaced the intake manifold gasket for an oil leak concern on this 96 Chevy pickup. In the process of that repair, we replaced the plastic distributor, which I hate those darn things. And I replaced them with its cam sensor with a nice robust aluminum unit. They sell those now. They're a whole lot nicer than those plastic ones that came on those Chevy trucks. This is that CSFI system, And we had to do an awful lot of work. I actually went ahead and tore that thing when we pulled the intake off. I went ahead and I went back with the electronic injection spider, which works a whole lot better than that silly old poppet spider that they had on there before. As a matter of fact, I think they do that at the Chevrolet place now when they work on one of those. All right, but we had to set the cam retard offset. A lot of the times I would hear people talking about how they had to have an oil leak fixed on their Chevy CSFI, Tahoe or whatever, and they said that the gas mileage went to pot after the work was done, and the shop that did the work would never be able. Well, what the shops were doing, I finally figured out, was they weren't setting the cam retard offset. Now you have to have a scan tool that will give you the cam retard offset in its display. If your cam retard offset is not available on your scan tool, you're going to have issues doing this. Now there is a way to do it, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. If I can, I probably should have put some pictures together on it, but what you got to do is you got to connect the scan tool, start the engine, let it idle so it's warm. The cam retard offset reading will not be accurate below 1,000 RPM, so you got to keep it above 1,000 RPM. You look at your cam retard offset number, and it's similar to what you have to do on your Dodges and your Jeeps that have the V8 in them. They have to have that distributor adjusted this way. You set that cam retard offset to 0, and you lock the distributor down, holding it above 1,000 RPM the whole time. That's how you do that. If the thing can't trust it, if the cam retard offset is off enough, It changes rotor alignment, but the cam sensor can't be trusted either. And when the controller can't trust the cam sensor, it bank fires the injector, and that just makes it, have terrible fuel economy. Anyway, if it 0 degrees. Now, if you looked it up, some of them the camera retard offset was different from 0, but most of them you set on 0. All right. Now, sometimes if you set the distributor, if you can't get it to adjust, you replace the distributor. And I have seen some that just generally didn't run all that good, and I would be checking in on this. You typically won't even get a code, but you can look at your camera retard offset, and if you can't adjust it, so it'll set on 0, and you're going to actually replace the distributor. And the distributor doesn't cost much; it ain't hard to replace, but I always set the camera retard offset after the fact. We found out though we had to replace not only the oil pan gasket on that truck, that was Dad's old truck, but the timing cover in order to stop the front leak. The Chevrolet went through a spell there where every time you had to pull the timing cover off, you're supposed to put a new one on there, the plastic ones, The exhaust had to be removed, get the flywheel cover and the pan off, and the timing cover. Of course, you're supposed to replace it. We put that. Now this Cadillac right here is a vintage vehicle that the president of the college showed me that on his phone one night at graduation, the Cadillac, and he said, "Look what I bought, Now this was a Cadillac that was a 71 model Cadillac, 500 cubic inch, and it had a 76 model engine in it, and it was a grand adventure. This one here was, I'm telling you. And he said it was giving trouble starting, and they put him a carburetor on it at some shop he stopped. He went up to somewhere in Georgia and bought it and was bringing it back, and it quit on him. And then it would the starter would make a lot of racket, but it wouldn't spin the engine over without turning the engine a little bit. There's just all kinds of issues going on with that darn thing. Well, he kept the old carburetor they took off, and then he brought it back down there for us to work on. And what I found was that starter, and that starter was one of these that bolts on there with bolts going in, not the one with like bolts going up like you usually have on a Chevrolet. And I may have mentioned this flywheel thing before, but I don't want to put pictures of it on there. And you see that tooth right there. Here, there, and yonder around that flywheel, there would be teeth knocked off of that thing. And that starter was kicking out there so hard, and that flywheel ring gear was tempered enough so that when that thing just met, see how these gear teeth are? See how they're made? All right, those gear teeth are made in such a way so that they would, that thing would hit them and it would just shear one off of there. And it did that repeatedly. It had done it 6 or 7 times. We put a flywheel in it, and we actually egg-shaped one of the bolt holes so we could adjust the starter and all that. And it knocked a tooth off of the new flywheel. And I said, I'm going to fix this. There's no other reason why not. So I got another flywheel, laid it up there, and beveled every one of the teeth on the flywheel to be the opposite of the bevel on the starter drive. And then we readjusted that starter, and that thing never knocked another tooth off, never had any more trouble with it. And that's what it took. You shouldn't have to engineer something like that, though. And I think there was a little product variability whenever they matched that 76 engine to that, 71 transaxle. Which, pulling that thing out was a booger bear and all, but Bobby was a real trooper. He pulled that thing out there 2 times. But anyway, we finally got it spinning over. There was no spark, and that's when we found, under the brand new distributor cap that shop had put on, they didn't even look at the points because they figured the wire and the caps and wires were new, so they figured the points were new too. It had broken the spring on the point, so we just had to put a set of points in it. Later on, we did an electronic ignition conversion on this car. I didn't say anything about that. And we got a lot of mileage out of that Cadillac. This particular picture here I took while one of my guys was replacing a Pitman arm in his parking lot while he was steering and driving around. The Pitman arm popped off just smooth. And of course that thing's really, really heavy, and that Pitman arm is putting up with an awful lot of stress. And a lot of the times whenever steering parts fail, they'll fail in a parking lot whenever you're turning and going real slow, because that's when they got the most strain on them. But we did, it was raining out there. We didn't have a place in the shop. We jacked it up, put stands under it. This guy here is a real humdinger. He got in there and changed that thing, laid it on a creeper. And we got that back going again. But that left him dead in the water. That Pitman arm breaks while you're a long way from home. He had to have the thing towed in with a wrecker. And the guy spent a lot of money on this car, but he loves the car. When we first got the car, the floorboard was so rotted out on it when he first brought the car to us, you could have actually stomped your foot on the floor and it would have gone through to the pavement. And so what we did was we pulled the seats and the carpet out and we sent it over to the welding department. And that guy, the welder, he loved to fool with old cars and stuff anyway. So he got a bunch of old metal from old car bodies and hoods and all that kind of stuff. And him and his welder guys, beat all that, cut all that old rusty metal out and welded in brand new metal for the floor pan. They just rebuilt the floor pan. And then he got brand new carpet for it. We put brand new carpet in there. We put seat belts in it. We did all the stuff that it needed to do. It still had automatic temperature control on it that still worked. That's what was so amazing on this thing. And even that big old ugly piece of hardware under the dash, they call that a programmer even back then if you look it up in the 71 Cadillac shop manual. And also, the firing order on the Cadillac is not like every other GM car, and I found that out in 1977 when I was working in the shop. When I thought I knew the firing order on every GM car, I just popped the spark plug wires from this Cadillac that I was working on, and it popped and snorted, and flames coming out the carburetor, and boom, shotgun out the muffler. And then I had to go look it up. Of course, you had to run the wires through the motor mounts and all that hard washing those old things back in them days. I looked it up and found out the firing order was a totally different critter on the Cadillac than it was these other GM cars. It made me feel like a dummy. And so, anyway, this is one last little story I'm going to tell you. And whenever I was working, when I first went to work at the college colors before we merged with another college were, crimson and gray. And so I would wear a shirt that color. I was renting my own uniforms. And we were up there one time and going to do some recruiting, and one of these little kids thought I was a fireman because I had a red shirt on. And this was right after 9/11. And he says, "You're in charge, you're looking after us because you're the fireman." And sometimes when I was wearing my dark blue shirt with my patches on it, I would get mistaken for a police officer, and people would start talking to me like I was a cop because I was a dark blue shirt. They didn't read my patches; I just kind of looked like a cop, And with the light blue shirt that I was wearing toward the end of my stint over at the college, they would look at that shirt and they would think that I was a paramedic. So I thought that was very funny anyway. But I hope you haven't been too bored by this, and I hope you enjoyed the 2 little short videos I put out. I've been going through my archives and building some videos and putting them on. And so this one here, I'm building it Saturday like what I've been doing, and then I'll put it up there to go out on Monday morning. And so I really appreciate you guys watching my videos, and I hope that this stuff does you some good. This video here was basically just some war stories on old stuff and all that, but there's nothing wrong with telling a war story every now and then if it's kind of entertaining. And so once again, I do appreciate your support on my YouTube channel. I try to stay away from anything political or whatever. Don't get YouTube to ban me for saying stuff they don't like, but that's not really what my YouTube channel is about anyway. Basically, I'm all about helping y'all. And I'm telling you, those little pieces of stainless steel that come out of wiper blades, I said you could use those for terminal unlatching tools. You'd be amazed how many uses you can come up for. I saved all of those I could out of old wiper blades. It was just handy as all get out to have a bunch of those things on hand. You'd be surprised what use you can find for them if you get some out. Well, anyway, I'm going to let you go, and until next time,